We need one more JavaScript aside before we look at exactly how module.exports, require, and all of that works. It's immediately invoked function expressions, or IIFEs, or IIFEs. This is extremely important to understand properly, and a fundamental aspect of how modules actually work. Remember that when we're talking about modules, we're not just talking about reusable blocks of code. We're also talking about code that's protected. That is, the code we write inside a module doesn't unintentionally impact any other code that we have written within our software. And so essentially we're talking about scope. Oh, big word alert. Scope. Essentially, at its most basic, scope means where in code you have access to a particular variable or function. So I have a variable, perhaps it's a number or a string or an object, or I have a function. Where else in my code can I access it? All right, so let's take a quick look at immediately invoked function expressions and how they affect scope. Let's go back to my app.js file. And this time, we'll show something interesting. What is an immediately invoked function expression? Well, it's exactly what it sounds like. I could have a function, but we've seen that I can do a function expression which can be anonymous. That is, I have no name, and it will create a function on the fly. However, just sitting here by itself, the JavaScript engine will view it as a regular function statement. That is a normal kind of basic kind of first function that you might learn to try and create. However, we don't want a basic function because that won't give us the extra functionality that we need. What we need is a function that's created and available to us in an immediate sort of sense, as if I was perhaps creating a string. See, I could say a string and then do a dot and then have access to the things that I can do with a string. Or I can do a number and a dot and have access to things I can do with a number. So I need a function and then immediately be able to run the function. I can do that by telling the engine that this is meant to be an expression, and there's a few ways to do that. The most common way is to simply wrap this in parentheses. That means it's an expression now, not just a function statement. I'm telling the engine will interpret this as, all right, now I have a function object I'm holding on to, and I can keep going. I can keep doing things with it, like invoke it. So I can put parentheses right here, and I'll put a semicolon. So I create a function and then immediately invoke it. So this is a function expression, and I've immediately invoked it. So it's an immediately invoked function expression. And let's say I create a variable, John. I'm going to console.log this. And let's say outside the immediately invoked function expression, I have another variable, also called first name. And I'll say that's Jane. Now if I run this, what do you think will happen? Well, I run it, node app.js, and I get John and Jane. So they both run. Now, what if I put the declaration of Jane above the immediately invoked function expression? So this will run, then this function will be run, and then we'll run console.log at the end. Now what do you think will happen? Let's go ahead and run it. And I still get John and Jane. In other words, the creation of this first name variable within the immediately invoked function expression impacted in no way the first name variable that I declared before it. Why? Because of scope in JavaScript. Whatever you create, whatever variables you create, functions you create within a function in JavaScript is protected within that function. It's only accessible within that function. It's scoped to that function. This is intentional. And as a result, it's the way that JavaScript developers for a long time have been kind of faking what a module should be. In other words, we can wrap our code in an immediately invoked function expression and make sure that it doesn't unintentionally affect anything outside of it. This console.log gets the first name that was intended, not the one that I created inside of here. So if this was in a separate JavaScript file, and I loaded this JavaScript file, this immediately invoked function expression, it wouldn't surprise me and change the value of first name. This variable here is protected and completely separate from the variables that are declared, that are created inside any particular function. And I use an immediately invoked function expression just as a shorthand. Instead of having to create a full function and then execute it, I can simply load this JavaScript file, and this immediately invoked function expression runs, which means my code inside the function runs, but again, it's protected. So this is an immediately invoked function expression, and that's why we use it. Oh, and one other thing. I can actually use a function like I normally would. So let's say I want a last name to be able to pass to this function. Well, I can pass it to the function where I invoke it, right here with these parentheses. So I could say doe. And then if I console.log last name, it will have this value that I passed to it when I invoked the function, just like I would any normal function. So I can run that, and there I see doe. All right, so we have an immediately invoked function expression, which behaves in a module-like fashion. Because of scoping in JavaScript, being scoped within the function, that is, what's created in the function is only accessible within the function, then I'm able to use it with the same intent that I might use a module. And this is actually what Node.js takes advantage of. All right, so now we're ready to answer the question, how does require and module.exports, how do modules in Node.js actually work? And then, how can I use them to their full advantage? Let's see.